Well, okay, so we say then, let's stop splitting these things that cannot be found split, because if we split them, our language is not structurally congruent with what's going on.
A thought occurs to me here when you put up feelings and thoughts. And it's been indicated that if you can change your thoughts, perhaps you can change your feelings. Now, could this be used like the premise and the conclusion or something like that?
Yeah, but we would say simply that, you could be, say, concentrating on a premise, and you could say, well, this is more on the so-called intellectual side of the continuum. I want to see what kind of formulation I'm dealing with here and what effects it's having on the way I function and so forth. But we're simply saying that while you're doing that, don't have the illusion that you are not, that there are no feeling aspects to that behavior. All right? Sometimes people say, well, what about mathematicians? I know this guy's a pure mathematician. I don't know if he floats in water or what, but a pure mathematician. Now there is an example of pure thinking. And then you attend a conference of mathematicians where they're presenting formulations to each other and watch them behave. It's completely intellectual. You can't do that. Or how beautiful. What an elegant formulation. Well, it's just, you just don't ever have one without the other. And to even say one without the other always tends to maintain the split while we're trying to put it together. Okay? So what language has put asunder, we general semanticists want to join. But be careful, we are not joining something. We're only changing the way that we're going to represent it to ourselves, because the stuff is joined at this level ab initio, okay, from as far back as we know. For me, I made a comment about this when I reviewed The Art of Awareness in the General Semantics Bulletin about 10 years ago. I commented I thought that Bois' diagrams are among his most creative contributions to the field of general semantics. And I would like someday to put a book out just of diagrams used in general semantics from the various authors who've made modifications of this and the things that Bois has done. And Bois' contribution there would be probably thicker than anybody else's. If you're interested in seeing what we're talking about, you can find that, the book is listed on your bibliography of The Art of Awareness, the man as a semantic transactor. Well, that would be a nice lead-in to a very important formulation, which is, as formulated, non-elementalistic. People will sometimes pay lip service to the non-split character of what they're discussing, and they said, however, for convenience or for analysis, we're going to talk about it this way anyway, and then within a few paragraphs, you say, guess what? It's not only a matter of convenience. It seems to be coming through now as a genuine split, because very often the arguments are structured in such a way that these things are being opposed to each other, and it seems clear that the author has just fallen right back into accepting the split. You cannot explain Einsteinian formulations by discussing the space separately and the time separately, because you just reach into the heart of that cosmology and vitiate it. You just leave yourself on a Newtonian beach. Let me proceed with the semantic reaction, but first I want to do one more example of a famous elementalistic split and show as a practical issue the effect that it had on an otherwise very useful book. As far as I know, and I know in this age of Aquarius, there's a lot of statements. As far as I'm concerned, not much data, but a lot of statements about so-called out-of-mind experiences, or out-of-body experiences, out-of-mind experience, that's the kind that I have. But out-of-body experiences and astral projecting and so forth. And I just want you to entertain the notion that formulating in that way may well be related to this habitual split that seems to exist in Well, in very, very many languages, and not just in the Indo-European. Well, of course, we would say, as far as we know, never one of these except as a function of one of these. If we find one of these that doesn't seem to have one of these, you see what I'm doing? We are, the language tends to have its way. The structure of the language forces us to keep doing this even while we're talking to try to stop doing it. So be aware of that terrific undertow effect of the traditional structure of the language that we try to use. Whether or not there's a structural fit between what I perceive and something outside myself, that, of course, is always the question. It's at the heart of general semantics, scientific method. Always humans have of trying to find out stuff. We have a bias in general semantics for empirical data to the extent that we can get it. You say, all right, you say, yeah, there are other bodies other than the physical. You say, well, fine, show me. What's the data? If we can't get the data, it doesn't mean we have to chuck out that speculation, but we have to continue to recognize it as a speculation rather than simply assert that the stuff is there. I mean, we could assert anything. We could just start off with, I think Wendell Johnson uses coined the word plogleys. A whole bunch of plogleys around. And let's say these walls are full of plogleys, and what plogleys do? They have a specific appetite. They're mostly teeth, for one thing. And they have a fabulous passion for human flesh. And these walls are just full of these plogleys are embedded in the walls, and they're very busily chewing their way through because they can smell all this flesh in here. And pretty soon we're going to see breaks in the wall, and they're going to be coming after us. Okay, should we do something about that? Get the hell out of here. That's right. So we are very fruitful in this way. You study mythology, and you say, oh, this is very clever. Mythology is extremely clever. These are ways that human brains have devised to try to make sense out of what they experience. Before we knew about the process character of reality, or we formulated atomic structure, people observed things happening, and we have this passion to assign some cause, usually not causes, but what's the cause of it? And in the absence of empirical data of some sort, we simply invent answers. And fine, that's a great human activity. My bias, and it's a bias that I think is central to general semantics also, is to say, okay, that's very interesting. I hear what you say, but what's the data? What data can we get at these levels to test what we're saying? We don't want to test these levels against what we say. We say the name of the game for sane functioning is to test what we say against these levels. Again, using the example of the paranoid schizophrenic. He has a theory about the universe as a hostile place. Everybody's out to get me. You're a person, therefore you're out to get me. And he consistently imposes this on all of his transactions at these levels. And he constantly perceives hostility and reinforces his formulations. In general semantics, we try to reverse that. And of course, if we're working with a schizophrenic so-called, we will say, okay, well, you formulate things in this way, but let's take a look at these nonverbal levels. If you can find one person who is not hostile, and you can become convinced that he's not, then at least to that extent you have to modify your theory. I just want to, we're concentrating on the mechanisms. As I said, you don't have to believe anything that I say, and it's certainly not necessary for this process to be considered successful for us all to agree on every point and say, okay, because I'm interested in general semantics, I'm supposed to think this about this subject. No, that's nonsense. We simply want to become conscious of our evaluating behavior and become conscious of abstracting. Well, there was a book called, what? The subtitle is Insights for the Age of Aquarius. What's the first part of that title? Yeah, Genus Sermonara. Okay? I think that's the way it's spelled. What's the first part of it? Isn't that the subtitle? Yeah, I know that, but I mean,
That's the title.
yeah, is that the full title? All right, Insights for the Age of Aquarius. And what Dr. Sermonara claimed to do was to, well, in effect, wed general semantics with parapsychology and quite a few other disciplines of that sort. Okay. She was at a seminar that I gave in New York about a year ago in March, and the seminar was a special one devoted to applying general semantics to general semantics. And what we did is we had various texts which I had selected, popular books in the field, and including Science and Sanity, and we examined various passages of the book to see if we felt that these were formulations that made any sense, or if there were weaknesses, or just what. And one of the books we used was hers, and she happened to be at the seminar, which was, I think, a very interesting experience for her. Now, in that book, she consistently opts for that split. That split practically energizes the whole book. Without that split, she could not have written that particular book. Now, the valuable aspects of this book, she's very good. There's a lot of good comparative religion material in there, which is quite sound, it seems to me, and very, very useful. But when she gets to her original formulations, in which she's, showing how general semantics is congruent with a lot of the Age of Aquarius kinds of disciplines, she very clearly plunks down in favor of this split. The term elementalism is not indexed. Various general semantics formulations are, and they are used. But the term elementalism, non-elementalism, is not indexed. It's a formulation that she did not choose to use. And I just want to point out, you do whatever you want with Dr. Sermonara's book, but I just want to point out this very close connection between the structure of the language that we use and what comes out as accepted data. If we insist that this is a split which cannot be found, at least for which we feel there is not strong empirical data, now distinguish this from anecdotage. There are many anecdotes, many statements. I think I've had quite a few experiences that if I were in a different discipline or had a different worldview, that I might express in terms of parapsychology and so forth and so on. My bias is toward neurobiology, and I simply conclude that when I have experiences that are similar to what I see described in that kind of literature, I simply allocate those experiences as functions of my neurological operations. To me, out-of-the-body experiences are functions of the nervous system. And the fact that those experiences may be very intense cannot serve as so-called empirical data to prove the experience. I experience what I experience. The question remains, the experience is here, represented by the circle. The question still remains, what is the relationship between this experience and the structures here? Okay? Non-identity of levels of abstracting. This is not this. Whatever I say is not this or this. Inferences are not descriptions. Higher order abstractings should not be confused with lower orders, and so forth and so on. All right. So we have to pick and choose. General semantics is a very rational discipline in the sense that it's made up of verbal formulations that are closely related to each other, that define each other, and is designed to try to generate very conscious evaluating. And a connection here, if we put the hyphen in, if we rejoin these, what has been mistakenly split, we say, all I want to stress now is that the results are going to be markedly different than if we maintain that split. The reason, or a reason, see how Aristotelian I am, really, deep down inside. Terrifically Aristotelian person. I didn't do 4 years of scholastic philosophy for nothing. It probably has disqualified me for certain kinds of behavior for the rest of my life. A reason for the formulation of semantic reaction, which is another one of Krzyzewski's original contributions to the formulations about human thinking and language and behavior and so forth, is the semantic reaction. And it derives from the non-elementalism formulation. It is intended very consciously as a non-elementalistic formulation. By definition, we say the semantic reaction constitutes the total response and we'll limit ourselves to human beings. I think it just sort of confuses things if we get into little disputations about does this apply to the gorilla or the chimpanzee and so forth. We're talking about ourselves. The total response of the human to a stimulus related to the meaning assigned to that stimulus. Assigned to that stimulus. Okay? Now we say the total response, we're saying total, stresses that because we mean including so-called intellectual and emotional components. Components is a very elementalistic term. The term components suggests that something is encapsulated, somehow set off from whatever it's close to or whatever environment it's plugged into. So even while we're doing this, we're using elementalistic terms to try to describe a non-elementalistic formulation. So we have to just be conscious of that. I think through consciousness of abstracting, we can do some of this stuff. We can still speak fairly primitively, but with relative safety, provided we realize the nature of the exercise that we're involved in. We distinguish two main kinds of semantic reaction. First of all, I have heard, in traveling around the country and conducting seminars, I have often heard people who have apparently wide experience in general semantics, have done a lot of study, taken a lot of courses, who try to avoid having semantic reactions. Can you do that? Well, I suppose you can. It's called coagulation. All right, so the semantic reaction is just a neutral, descriptive formulation. We don't say the semantic reaction is something bad or good. We simply say whatever our response to whatever stimulus with relation to the meaning that we assign to it, we call that a semantic reaction. What happened?
You knew I wasn't paying attention.
Yes, you were paying attention, but to something else.
Yes, exactly.
But I'm more interested at the moment, if you don't mind, in your response. What happened just then? You tried to catch it. Okay. Could you describe what occurred?
I saw the truck coming. Well, first I saw you winding up. I figured you were going to throw it this direction. And I saw the truck coming, and I put my hand out here. I wasn't really concentrating on it that much. It was close to him.
Bad throw. Did you have any kind of, as part of this constellation of response, did you have any kind of avoidance reaction?
I thought it was kind of an odd thing to do.
Oh, strange, but you're not too surprising. I thought you would think that, yeah. Okay. Did you feel at all threatened by that?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
No. Do you have any idea why not?
I play soccer, the ball's a little bit bigger. That's one thing.
Suppose we had done this on the street and you had never seen me before.
Threw the chalk at me?
Yeah. Suppose that I just came up to you on the street.
No, I would have just thought that you were strange.
You might have felt a little more threatened than here, I suppose.
The piece of chalk? No. I mean, it's happened to me before. People have thrown things at me.
Just come up to you on the street?
No,
Do you
I
elicit
was
this
in a
kind of behavior?
demonstration. No, not just walking along down the street. Kids have.
Yeah.
Kids have thrown stuff at me fairly often. And I used to throw things too when I was little. I would throw things at people, snowballs and that.
Okay. My wife once reported having an egg thrown at her walking through a certain neighborhood not far from us. And she said, well, the neighborhood is coming up. They used to throw rocks. Apparently becoming affluent. All right, to me that's a very interesting reaction.
They were showing more concern.
Yeah. She said, little boy, why did you throw that? I said, I'm just trying to feed you. You're kind of hungry. Okay, we distinguish, gee whiz. I think I'm starting to suffer from aphasia. We distinguish two main kinds of semantic reaction, the signal reaction or signal response and the symbol reaction. We formulate the symbol reaction as characteristically human, delayed, and conditional. Conditional, that is related to present circumstances, to present conditions. The signal reaction we evaluate as primarily of the animal character, immediate, and conditioned. Strictly a kind of a statistical summary representation of all past experiences of a similar kind. You accepted the behavior as somehow related to this situation, apparently. Yeah. Okay, well I would suggest that that's a symbol reaction rather than a signal reaction. Now we don't want to set up a new elementalistic split. We have suggested semantic reaction as the total response, intellectual feeling and so forth, to a stimulus associated with the meaning that you assigned to it. Well, obviously you assigned a meaning that was related to this context. Like this is some kind of demonstration, perhaps. And I'm not really having a piece of chalk thrown at me in a hostile sort of way, but this is somehow, maybe I don't know how just right now, but somehow part of this process. Yes?
But maybe, I thought a signal reaction was when you automatically respond to something that's, when you
Yeah, that's right.
respond to things, so.
But it seems to me that there was more involved than just that, wasn't it? Now there are signal aspects, the reflex to just reach out or to go like that. Usually when I do that, and you won't be surprised to hear that I've done this before, There's that kind of reaction. Okay? So that in itself has a kind of a signal character. It's part of a conditioned response. It's a reflex action and very important. But part of the total symbol reaction, because the person, even while doing this, which you can't avoid doing in most cases, is already aware that this is part of the point. This is part of a lecture point. This is part of a demonstration. Okay? Well, I think the useful thing about this is to evaluate your own responses and see, suppose that, let's establish, say, a symbol-signal continuum. Where do you spend most of your time in reacting? Some of our job says, what the hell's going on here? How often? Is that pretty typical? If so, we would say that you're primarily acting sort of in an animal, unconditional way. And the curious thing about that is that apparently it's not good for you. Just like negatively evaluating yourself and inducing extra hydrochloric acid flow in your stomach when there's no food there to be digested can make a hole in your stomach. This kind of reaction, very rigid, apparently has very devastating effects at electrocolloidal levels. Let's put this little diagram up to summarize this. We used a film at the Institute seminars called Seifert's on Protoplasm. Seifert is a very well-known biologist. I believe he's still functioning. Has not yet coagulated. And we have a little film that's done by him. It's very charming, which talks about the characteristics of protoplasm. And he goes out in the woods with his wife and they gather samples of the slime mold, which is characterized as a rather large, just mass of protoplasm. As close to no structure as you can have and still be able to pick up something. And they examine the characteristics of this stuff out of which we are all built, protoplasm, and they discover such things, for example, as that, as I mentioned before, caffeine dissolves protoplasm. I believe alcohol causes it to coagulate. So you might consider that as you consider your drinking habits. The lesson that I have drawn from this film is that the proper state for protoplasm, in order for it to maintain itself as a living system, is the gel state. The two extremes that constitute death for protoplasm are coagulation and liquefaction. Well, okay. These are not so-called abstract issues. All abstractions that we have any knowledge of at all occur here. They are produced by protoplasm, and they produce certain states in protoplasm. Okay? So I think that's a very important point to make in general semantics, to survey your own responses, not in the sense of what was this particular response to this particular situation, but statistically, what kind of pattern emerges? Am I constantly blowing off and in that kind of situation, or am I so consistently unaffected by what's happening in the environment that I constitute part of the background? Either condition, I'm suggesting, constitutes pathology, and if carried to an extreme, would constitute death, whatever the death date turns out to be. And now, please turn the cassette over for the start of side B. Josiah Royce was the philosopher who first formulated the notion of the self-reflexive map, and he observed primarily that the process of making maps of maps can be continued indefinitely. You can always map a previous mapping. You can always say something about what you said before. And so we recognize that this is a continuous process, and a good practical derivative from this is don't think you've said the final word. Other words could be said about those words that you just said. Another thing about this, Royce suggested that the ideal map, ideal meaning not real, the ideal map would include a map of itself. And Korzybski very, I think, wisely suggested we ought to get off that kick, to not try to produce ideal maps. But at the same time, through consciousness of abstracting or consciousness of map making, we can recognize that although I cannot make a map which includes my map, that indeed in a functional, operational way, any map I make includes me as the map maker. And Bois, Sam Bois spelled this out, I think, in a very simple, clear way. Any map may be seen as a map of the map maker making his map. All of his assumptions that were related to that map making process, his skills as a formulator, are all part of what's talked about. Any brain can be seen as a modeler. The brain is a modeling system, a map making system. But in the process of mapping anything that I presume to be outside, I am inevitably at the same time mapping myself. In a very strict sense, the brain can only talk about its own content. I've been doing it for 2.5 days with relation to you, and you've been doing it with relation to me and each other. We can only map ourselves self-reflexively. Very important formulation. Now this notion of a map, or being able to make a map of a previous map indefinitely, I've indicated in this sequence here. If we consider what's represented by the parabola, the process universe, everything that's going on, as kind of the ultimate territory, territory sub-zero, a related map to that, which I put together in my head, would be map sub-zero. This is the primary map that I can make. The initial mapping of my interaction with the process universe, with all the stuff that I managed to get somehow and transduce, and also recognizing that however good my mapping is, I leave out a terrific amount. Right now, everyone here is mapping his and her current experience, and you're leaving out a lot more than you can possibly include. If I decide, now of course once I make a map though, this map can become a territory in its own right and can be the subject of subsequent mapping. So if I now call map sub-zero as a territory, territory sub-1, and I map that, map sub-1 relates to territory sub-1, a previous mapping. Do I map non-verbally? Is this a map of what I'm getting from here? Sure. Okay. So we're never free of map making. In fact, that's the name of the game, isn't it? And so we go on and on. Each map becoming a territory for a subsequent map which is at a higher order of abstracting than the territory to which it is related. Now there's a great value to adapting the mathematical notion of function to our daily living. You can realize that, for example, your alertness in the morning may be a function of whether or not you've had coffee. Your disappointment in any situation has got to be a function of your expectations. No disappointments in a vacuum. Anytime that you experience disappointment, if you have any wish to understand how come, you must look back at your expectations. By the extensional orientation, we formulate a way of dealing with things where the preference, the bias is toward observation, as opposed to just verbal definitions. It doesn't mean that we limit ourselves to silence or to pointing in an idiotic way, in a way that would prevent us from being time binders, but it does mean that while we retain the capacity to formulate, to speak, to organize things in a logical way, to use standard grammar in writing, for example, in speaking, while we maintain that ability, we recognize that whatever we may say, its value can, in the final analysis, be only determined by relating what we say to the nonverbal world, to what we can observe. So we keep checking what we say against what we can observe, recognizing, of course, that that, too, is not a foolproof system. Non-identity. F, okay, the map is not the territory. All we read, it's a very simple formulation, central, maybe the most important one in general semantics. To identify is to confuse orders of abstracting. If I identify my inferences with descriptions, I'm confusing orders of abstracting. If I identify my silent level experiences, my feelings of astral projection, with what is going on in the parabola, I'm confusing orders of abstracting. Neuro-linguistic feedback. Oh, okay. What I say affects what I see. And what somebody else says may affect what I see. The mechanism, neuro-linguistic feedback. Previous mapping tends to determine present mapping. That would be an example of neuro-linguistic feedback. Logical fate. G. Okay. From premises, conclusions, behaviors follow. Now, I like that K answer I heard someone say, you can't unboil an egg, except that makes the logical fate sound too unrelieved. No, that's right, too fatey. In fact, we were making the point that if we become conscious of logical fate, we can, to some extent, overcome its imposition on us. If we didn't subscribe to that, I don't believe we'd be here at this seminar. By being here, we are making a statement. I think it is possible for people to examine their premises, to become conscious of abstracting, enter consciously into their subsequent abstracting, and make differences therefrom. Anybody know what H stands for in that context? Happiness. Happiness is. Okay, so what follows from that? Bruce? P? Let's see what P. Okay, U I think would be a better fit. If you, oh no, you, yes, yeah, minimum expectations. That completes the formula. That's the so-called Korzybski happiness formula. Happiness equals minimum expectations. But we should add to that plus maximum motivation. Now, when we say minimum expectations, we do not mean the lowest possible expectations, where you're constantly pegging your expectations at the such a low level you might not get off your duff. But expectations that are within some kind of realistic framework. Who's the poet? Browning said, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp."
Did you say maximum expectation?
No, minimum. Minimum.
Minimum
Yeah, happiness equals plus maximum motivation.
That's what
You're not going to be hostile, are you?
Yeah. Too hot in this thing.
Yeah, okay, fine. I'm glad we're making it too hot for you. Etc. W. Okay? The map is not all of the territory. The big three. The map is not the territory. The map is not all the territory. You can never say all about anything. And the maps are self-reflexive. We can't escape the implications of our own mapping behavior. Scientific method. Yeah. That's a nice hypothesis. Let's check it. Notice how scientific method, as here presented, matches very nicely with the extensional orientation. In both cases, we're not talking about being struck dumb, but we're talking about evaluating our speech against what we can observe non-verbally. We tend, as human beings, most generally to do the opposite. We formulate, and then we try to impose our formulations on the nonverbal environment. If we don't see a fit, we have one. Irreversible processes. Yeah, K. We should say you can't 1979 unboil an egg. Oh, those people in the laboratories are so clever. I fully expect that within the next 10 years some clouds are to come out here. We say, guess what? I just reversed this egg to an ovum state, this boiled egg. But so far, we're at that state. Time binding. M, cooperation across generations. But let's enrich that and also realize that time binding refers to intra-generational cooperation. Intra, within the generations. You and I don't have to wait until one of us dies to cooperate. We are involved in a time-binding process right now. We can control time to some extent to promote our own ends. IFD disease.
What's that? Oh, that's frustration.
Congratulate yourself. That's the second thing you're learning this afternoon. What'd you say?
Ideal, frustration, and demoralization.
Yeah, idealization, frustration, demoralization. Okay, the idea here, or the formulation, is that if we set up ideal expectations, which by definition are not realistic, we must necessarily experience frustration with relation to those expectations. We know that nervous systems function in such a way that if they repeatedly experience frustration, they start to break down. Electrocolloidal changes occur, which are expressed as pathology at the behavioral level. And Johnson called that demoralization. All right, IFD disease, then a person who experiences that must have done something. So what's the match? P. Okay, I forgot. Happiness equals minimum expectations plus maximum motivation. Yeah, I would stress again that notion of maximum motivation. I mean, really, you got to work at it. And again, although there's a lot of talk including in Krzyzewski about the automatic benefits that would flow from internalizing general semantics, well, maybe that's the case if the formulations are internalized. But getting to the point where those formulations are internalized requires a tremendous amount of work, a lot of self-awareness, and increasing ability to see how you have fouled up, and not being turned off by that or plunged into despair, but say, well, so what else is new? I did it again, but maybe next time it'll be better. All right, general semantics. T, okay. Modern, open, applied epistemology. A succinct definition of general semantics, totally opaque to those who have not studied general semantics. When I first started working in this field, I used to very glibly give very short, snappy definitions of general semantics. And then I finally became aware enough to notice the glazed look on people's faces, their eyes. So I don't do it anymore. I said, would you like to take a course? Indexing. Okay, big C. Politician 1 is not politician 2. Increasingly today, this is an important formulation. So easy just to say, oh, these politicians. I've given up on politics. That's a very political statement. Dating. A, big A. I evaluate myself as a process. Bob Pula, October, what's today? 7th, 1979, is not Bob Pula, October 8th, 1979, 7th, 1979, on and on and on. You might try an interesting exercise with that. Date yourself back to the moment where the sperm and the ovum met and started growing into you. To you, to you, to you, to you, to you. Striking thing to do. Hyphen. B, okay. I can only talk about the observed continuum as it applies to me. That's all I can speak about. I can say words that say, oh no, I'm withdrawing myself from this context and I'm standing aside. I'm being completely objective. That's a form of whoredom, and I abhor it. Quotes. Big D, that's all that's left. Watch it, the word's loading. The question was, what's the difference between general semantics and semantics? So very quickly we can go through. Sometimes I do this at the beginning, but decided that time was too short to go into this in this particular context, but we can go through very quickly. 4 ways to examine language. We can look for word-to-word relations. There are many other ways, of course, but this is 4 that relate to what we're into. And we call that examination of word-to-word relationships grammar. Grammar, what big clause you have. Well, the better to be independent, my dear. The basic unit of analysis for the grammarian is the sentence. And please note that the grammarian is in no position to evaluate statements as true or false. He can only evaluate them as structurally sound from the point of view of the structure of the language. That is all. A very modest calling. Unfortunately, most of our English teachers are only grammarians, or at least many of them in my experience, I should say. A higher order, we examine sentence-to-sentence relationships. The basic unit there is the paragraph. You got to have at least 2 sentences to examine a relationship, so that constitutes a paragraph, and we call this logic, that kind of linguistic analysis. The third kind, semantics, and here we're concerned with examining the relationship of statements to something outside the statements, to something essentially nonverbal. There can be other statements, but sooner or later we want to reach the nonverbal level. And we evaluate statements. What? R-E-F-E-R-E-N-T, referent or referent, and simply means that to which the statement refers.
Referring to what the REL?
Relationships. Yeah, it's a little cheapo abbreviation. Statement to referent relationships. And here's where we, for the first time, start getting into whether or not statements are true, as we did with our exercise on Friday night. We determined whether a statement was true by seeing whether or not it fit with the data that had been presented. Okay? It goes with number 2. We can examine utterances for validity.
That's number 2.
Yeah, number 2. The logician is concerned with validity. He is not equipped to determine the truth value of any set of statements as a logician. If he wants to determine is the set of statements true as opposed to just being valid, that means they fit together. They make some sense as statements fitting together. But if he wants to find out if the statements are true, he must go at least to this level and look outside the statements and match up. Look for a structural match between the set of statements and something going on. There are 5,000 tables in this room. Therefore, since this is a room which could hold 10,000 tables, we have plenty of room. Well, if we're in a room that could hold 10,000 and we only have 5,000, it makes sense to say we have plenty of room. But then we make a semantic analysis of that utterance. We look around the rooms and get out of here. We only have, I don't know, 10 or 12 or so tables in here, and it's a little bit crowded. So the statement, series of statements, although valid, in that they make sense with relation to each other, turn out to be not true. Isn't that what we find out in psychiatric hospitals all the time? The problem with patients in hospitals of that sort isn't that they can't reason properly. They do very well usually. They're in fact trapped by the power of their own logic. The problem is that they cannot examine their underlying assumptions. They will remain entrapped because they keep making valid conclusions drawn from their premises. It just happens that their premises are not true. All right.
Is that your definition of semantics? Number 3.
Yes, semantics is the discipline, primarily verbal and highly mathematized in formal semantics, that examines the relationship between statements and the things the statements refer to. General semantics is concerned with a much broader set of relationships, and that's why I'm personally very unhappy when I hear people who are in general semantics or study general semantics refer to themselves as semanticists.
Yeah.
I personally am not a semanticist in this sense. I consider myself a person working in the field of general semantics, which is not just a generalized semantics. It's an unfortunate term, which we can't go into now, that Krzyzewski used for various historical reasons, but we must learn to think of it as simply a separate term, a technical term, which labels the discipline that we're working in. And we're concerned with the relationships between language, what we call thinking, reality, structures as primarily derived from the natural sciences, and we should add one more to this, behavior. Can we understand what we're doing in terms of this set of relationships? So we can say that in general semantics we're concerned with the relationships between symbol systems and nervous systems as expressed in behavior. All right? And that is a big order. And that's why we've been able in just 2.5 days to say all there is to say.
The semantics isn't that I always thought of it as an analysis of words or meaning.
Well, stop doing that.
Okay.
Etymology, philology, fine. Good linguistic disciplines. Semantics is the first discipline where we start to examine language by getting out of it, at least somewhat. But it doesn't get out of the language circle nearly as much as we try to do in general semantics. And that's one reason why we were sitting on the lawn holding hands and looking at each other's eyes yesterday. Because we realized that just making the verbal formulations is necessary but not sufficient. Final word?
Final word.
Thank you.